In this episode, we talk about Chinese people occupying border defense villages that share their border with India's northeastern region. We also talk about TMC MP Mimi Chakraborty announcing a resignation. But first, we talk about the Supreme Court striking down the contentious Electoral Bond scheme. Hi, this is Niharika Nanda, and you are listening to Three Things, an Indian Express news show. Yesterday, in a historic decision, the Supreme Court struck down the Electoral Bond scheme of the government and deemed it unconstitutional. The scheme was initially proposed by the late Arun Jaitley in 2017 when he served as the finance minister, and it essentially allowed individuals to make anonymous donations to their preferred political parties. In fact, the scheme, which over the years raised concerns among political watchdogs, became the single biggest mode of donating to political parties. Since it was first introduced 6 years ago, the BJP received over 6,500 crore rupees via electoral bonds, while the Congress received over 1,100 crore rupees through them. Shortly after the verdict was announced yesterday, senior advocate Prashant Bhushan addressed the media.
The Supreme Court has struck down the electoral bond scheme, comprehensively struck it down, and all the provisions that were made to bring it into effect in the Income Tax Act, in the Companies Act, etc., everything has been struck down. They have held that this violates the fundamental right to information of citizens to know about who is contributing this much money to political parties, etc. They have also struck down the amendment made which allowed unlimited political contribution being made by companies to political parties. So, not only the
and when senior advocate and Rajya Sabha MP Kapil Sibal, who led the argument for the petitioners in the case, spoke to the media, he said that this verdict provides a level playing field in democracy and is a huge ray of hope.
Not just for A, B or C political party, but for democracy itself. It's a huge ray of hope for citizens of this country. Because this whole scheme, which was the brainchild of my late friend Arun Jaitley, was in fact choreographed to enrich the BJP. Because everybody knew that the BJP was in power and that any donations through electoral bond scheme would come to the BJP. But the interesting part is...
In this segment, we are joined by Indian Express's Apurva Vishwanath to talk about this case and how the Supreme Court arrived at its judgment. Apurva, can you begin by telling us how electoral bonds work and the reason why they became so contentious?
So the electoral bond scheme was announced in 2017 in the union budget. So these are essentially interest-free bearer instruments through which you can donate money to political parties anonymously. So you can say buy an electoral bond in multiples of 1,000, which means 1,000, 10,000, 1 lakh and up to 1 crore. Only the State Bank of India is authorized to sell them. So donors can purchase these bonds and then give it to a political party of their choice. And the party then can encash it within 15 days of receiving such an electoral bond. This was a big departure from the campaign finance laws that we had earlier. So pre-2017, before the electoral bond scheme came in, there were a lot more disclosures about who is giving money to a political party, and also from the point of view of a political party about where they're receiving this money from. Political parties were required under the Representation of People's Act to disclose all contributions over 20,000, right? And they had to maintain a record of all donations which were more than 10,000 rupees for taxation purposes. So basically only up till 20,000, I could anonymously pay to a political party. But if it was more than 20,000, you had to maintain records. You had to tell the political party who you are. And that was the transparency in the process. And also for corporations, right? Because for companies, when they are donating to a political party, there was a cap on how much they can donate. So from their net profits, which was actually their average net profit over a period of the last 3 years, they could donate only a maximum of 7.5% of their average annual net profits for 3 years. What the electoral bond scheme did was first take away this cap on corporate financing. which means a company from their profits could donate as much as they wanted to a political party. And the second part is really the anonymity aspect of it, which is also a big bone of contention from a transparency point of view. The voter does not know who the political party is receiving funding from. The political party is not required to disclose this in their annual reports. So if the political party is not passing on this information to the voter, you don't know who is funding a party's election, essentially. So these two aspects, essentially, that unlimited corporate funding of elections and the anonymity of the donors, these were the two issues, essentially, that framed the debate, which has now been settled by the Supreme Court.
And talk about the arguments that were made by the main petitioners of the case.
So the framing of this argument is essentially this, that when a voter does not know where the money comes from, the voter does not know if there is, in a sense, a quid pro quo between the donor and the political party. Suppose I gave 1,000 rupees to a political party, and when that political party came into power, and I was favored through a policy decision of that government, is there a link between that? If the voter is aware of this information, even let's say it's accidental, it's coincidental and there is no link, but the voter would know this and vote based on that knowledge. And free and fair elections are an essential facet of being a democracy. So there we have a fundamental right to know. There is a right to information, receive public information under Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution. It forms part of your free speech. So can the government completely encroach on this free speech? And to what extent can the government encroach on this fundamental right? And to what end? Why should the government interfere with fundamental rights to achieve what objective?
Right. And now, as you mentioned, Supreme Court has put the entire debate to rest and has deemed the electoral bond scheme to be unconstitutional. Tell us, how did the court reach that conclusion?
So the Supreme Court has essentially struck down the electoral bond scheme primarily on two grounds. One is that it violates the fundamental right to information, which is part of your free speech, like we earlier discussed. The second aspect is on the corporate funding aspect of it, whether the lack of any disclosure norms, if it is allowed in law. Here, the government's argument was this, that electoral bonds, the scheme essentially tackles two things. One is curbing the use of black money in elections. And two, it also protects the anonymity of the donor, which is very important, is what the government claimed. So for starters, curbing black money in elections was something that the late Finance Minister Arun Jaitley also talked about when he introduced this bill. You have to bring campaign finance into a formal economy where this entire system was cash heavy and, it would not be through proper banking channels. Electoral bonds was envisaged as a way to route this through banking channels. And what Jaitley said at that time in Parliament was that in order to incentivize the donor, the government is giving them this cover of anonymity. So it is only to incentivize them. It is a means to an end. And the end is, of course, to curb black money. But 7 years later, when this was being debated in the Supreme Court, Solicitor General Tushar Mehta, who sort of led the arguments for the government in court, argued that both protecting donor anonymity as well as curbing black money, both are objectives of this law. So the court had to essentially check whether the encroachment on fundamental rights is justified to achieve this objective. Simply put, is the objective too small, too negligent, and too unconnected to be encroaching into a citizen's fundamental rights to this extent?
Right. So when we talk about the government's argument that a citizen's right to remain anonymous is crucial to this scheme, it is the citizen's right to privacy. So what does the Supreme Court's verdict say regarding that?
So the court, in one sense, does say that anonymity of the donor is a facet of privacy. But is that facet of privacy, can you counterbalance it against the fundamental right to know? Or can there be complete anonymity? And for this, we have to look at the law that we had till the Electoral Bond scheme came in. So what the Representation of People's Act said was anonymous donations over 20,000 required you to essentially disclose who that money was coming from, which means the Parliament in its wisdom thought there was some threshold. There was a threshold which, when you cross, transparency outweighs the donor's anonymity. So this is what essentially the court says, that the government has to choose a less intrusive way to curb black money in campaign finance. It has to choose a less intrusive method to protect the anonymity of donors as well. So in this scheme of things, whatever we have, the electoral bond scheme does not meet these standards.
Okay. And the other argument of the government was that the electoral bond scheme tackles the issue of black money being used in electoral financing. And that is why it is reasonable to restrict RTI. So why does the court not accept that argument?
So the government's argument has been that if you bring campaign finance through formal banking channels, that in itself will curb the use of black money in elections. But what the petitioners had argued is that the State Bank of India will only act as an instrument to distribute these electoral bonds to political parties. That means State Bank of India is pretty much the cashier where you go buy an electoral bond and give it to whoever you want. But the government is not tracking the source of funds. Suppose the money is coming from a shell company. Suppose the money is coming through illicit means. That aspect of tracking that money. So are you really ensuring that only clean money comes to State Bank of India where you can go buy an electoral bond? That is the argument that the petitioners essentially framed, that you're only looking at the end point, but not looking at the larger funnel itself of where the money is coming from. So in that sense, does it really satisfy the objective of curbing black money? That's something that the petitioners argued. And here the onus falls on the state to prove that, yes, this is a foolproof way to curb black money, which in this case the state has not been able to do.
And the other issue that the court had to look at was the extent to which companies could donate to political parties through the scheme. What does the verdict say regarding that?
So now the court has struck down the specific amendments that were brought in through the Finance Act in 2017, which means this cap that was removed, which allowed unlimited corporate funding in elections, that also has been struck down. So essentially, we go back to the pre-2017 scheme of things as of now, which means the 7.5% cap on your net profits, that will apply as of now.
And Apurva, electoral bonds have been the single biggest mode of donating to political parties. With SC striking them down, what implications would this have for political parties and for the electoral system?
So this whole system that we had before the electoral bond scheme, that still continues. As far as political parties are concerned, it's not as if this is retrospectively applied to parties, which means in the last 7 years, the money that they've collected through electoral bonds, which has been spent or may not have been spent, that still remains with the political parties. It's not as if the court is sort of seeking a refund. So it is the new tranche, which means that the State Bank of India would have opened the window for a new tranche before the Lok Sabha elections, right? That will not happen now.
And next, we talk about China developing infrastructure near the LAC. For several years now, China has been building infrastructure along the line of actual control, or LAC, bordering India's northeastern region. Apart from improving connectivity by constructing roads and bridges in the region, China has also been building hundreds of villages along the border that India shares with the Tibet Autonomous Region for over 5 years now. These villages are called well-off villages or border defense villages and can be used for both civil and military purposes. But for most part, they were never actually occupied. That was until a couple months ago when Chinese nationals began occupying several of these border villages. In this segment, Indian Express's Amrita Nayak Datta, who covers defense for the paper, joins my colleague Rahel Philipose to talk about these villages, why they were built in the first place, and why they are now being occupied.
So, Amrita, where does the India-China relationship stand at the moment? What's the current situation at the line of actual control?
So, Rahel, as you know, since 2020, India and China have been engaged in a military standoff along the entire LAC in eastern Ladakh. While some disengagement have taken place over the years at certain friction points along the LAC, and this I'm talking about eastern Ladakh, after multiple rounds of military talks, there are some old pending issues like Depsang Plains and Demchok which are yet to be resolved. Thus, any disengagement of troops from these places and an overall de-escalation of troops in the Ladakh region is yet to take place. Like eastern Ladakh, there are several areas in the northeast too, particularly in the Tawang sector of Arunachal Pradesh and in eastern Arunachal Pradesh, where there are several disputed areas along the border. For instance, the Yangtze region of Tawang has often seen clashes every year between Indian and Chinese troops, except with the exception of last year. China has always tried to claim Tawang as part of a larger Tibet while calling Arunachal Pradesh as southern Tibet, and India has always kept this region militarily fortified. So, the overall situation along the LAC has been tense, particularly in the last few years.
Right. And considering all of that, Amrita, how has China been developing its infrastructure along the LAC?
So, Rahel, the Chinese has been very aggressively building infrastructure all along the LAC, both in the northeast and in eastern Ladakh. Even as the LAC, it remains far off from most inhabited areas or areas of importance, except for regions like Tawang and the Siliguri corridor. They have been building roads, bridges, habitat for their troops. They have been building a lot of infrastructure to increase their access to the LAC. So in Tawang, they had already built a lot of infrastructure. But even in other areas like the Siang Valley of Arunachal Pradesh and all across eastern Ladakh, they have been consistently improving their existing infrastructure as well, including their connectivity to the LAC, constructing roads and bridges, and also their model villages where they plan to house some Chinese nationals. So they have also been constructing this infrastructure along the LAC, and they have also been conducting some of these villages in Bhutanese territory.
Right, and there's a fair bit of mystery surrounding these villages. What do we really know about them?
So this Chinese border defense villages or well-off villages, China has been constructing them since the last 5 years or more. 628 such villages are being constructed along India's border with the Tibet Autonomous Region, including in Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh. The exact purposes of these villages have always remained unclear. There have been a secrecy around it, but they are understood to be dual-use infrastructure, which means they can be used both by the civil population as well as for military purposes. And Indian strategic experts have often seen them as Chinese assertion of their territorial claims along the LAC. So they have remained a concern for the military. These buildings have been like very large, double-story, spacious, whitish in color, and they were being constructed along the LAC for a very long time. But traditionally, they have always remained unoccupied. It's only in the last few months, Chinese nationals have started actually occupying them, at least some of them.
Right. And how has India responded to all of this? Is India also developing its own infrastructure around the LAC?
So India has given a big push on border infrastructure in the last 3-4 years. If you see in eastern Ladakh, India has built a lot of roads, a lot of bridges, a lot of habitat for the troops, and also the associated infrastructure like ammunition dumps and everything else for the troops who are staying there. So large-scale infrastructure is being constructed along the LAC in eastern Ladakh, and so has the situation been in northeast. Even in the northeast, in Arunachal Pradesh itself, 3 major highways are at different stages of construction right now, including the Trans-Arunachal Highway, the Frontier Highway, the East-West Industrial Corridor Highway. There are also plans to further improve connectivity to Tawang. There are roads being built in eastern Arunachal Pradesh, in the Dibang Valley. Most of these places, especially in eastern Arunachal, I would say the infrastructure in Tawang has been very good since it is of high strategic importance. But in eastern Arunachal, if you see, the roads are really bad, and in certain places there are no roads. You know, the border villages, they're not very well connected with roads. So a lot of roads and bridges are being built there as well. And there is a lot of focus on improving connectivity through passes and also improving the inter-valley connectivity. So if there are multiple passes leading to the LAC, they should be connected amongst each other also. So laterals are also being built. And this is apart from improving the existing border villages, of course, which is part of India's Vibrant Villages program.
You mentioned the Vibrant Villages program. What exactly is it, Amrita? And are there similarities to China's border defense villages?
So, Rahel, under the Vibrant Villages program, India plans to develop 663 border villages into modern villages with all amenities in the first place. Of them, at least 17 such villages along the borders with China in Ladakh, Himachal, Uttarakhand, Sikkim and Arunachal Pradesh have been selected for development as a pilot project under the program in the first phase. Now, as we just spoke about, China has already started to occupy some of their border defense villages along the LAC opposite the Tawang sector of Arunachal Pradesh and opposite Lohit Valley of Arunachal Pradesh. So India, in Arunachal Pradesh, the villages in the eastern part of the state and in the Tawang sector such as Zemithang, Taksing, Chayang Tajo, Tuting and Kibithu, these are some of the places where villages have been identified to be developed as, modern villages under this Vibrant Villages program.
And in the end, we talk about MP Mimi Chakraborty, the star face of the Trinamool Congress. Yesterday, Chakraborty made public her decision to step down as the Jadavpur MP, stating that she had tendered her resignation to West Bengal Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee. While doing so, she also said that she would not be contesting in the upcoming Lok Sabha polls. The first-time MP told the media that if the Chief Minister accepted her resignation, she would submit her resignation letter to the Lok Sabha Speaker.
I have resigned, but my resignation is not accepted, and she'd accept calling me CM, and she said that she will take care of everything.
Chakraborty, who was one of the 6 famous personalities who contested the previous Lok Sabha election on TMC tickets, conveyed to the media that politics is not meant for her. In a report for the paper, Indian Express's Sweetie Kumari highlights that this development follows shortly after another star TMC MP, Deepak Adhikari, widely known as Dev, expressed similar sentiments. Currently, Dev has resigned from 3 administrative posts in his Ghatal constituency, sparking speculation about his potential exit from politics. When questioned about it, he mentioned the possibility of not contesting the upcoming Lok Sabha polls. However, he clarified that he had discussed the matter with the Chief Minister, leaving the final decision in her hands. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank, Bhargava, Rahel, Philipose and me, Niharika, Nanda. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it and share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcasts@express.com.